So choosing the PC parts as a creator is a little bit different than when you're choosing them as a gamer. In fact, it's completely different, especially when you're upgrading the parts. A lot of things that seem important to gamers are not important to creators at all. And some of the things gamers want to upgrade literally give a 0% performance gain as a creator. So don't fall for these upgrade myths as a creator. Let's talk. By the way, those boxes, they're empty, so don't you worry, I didn't throw my graphics cards around there. Now, upgrades are especially important when you are choosing a laptop as a creator, because when you're choosing a laptop, you're looking around on the site and you're looking, okay, there's CPUs and GPUs, they're actually built into the chassis. So you can see there's a 3050 Ti laptop, 3060 Chillblast one, there is 3070 Ti somewhere over here, 3080, look at that. This is 3070 Ti here as well. But knowing which specs to configure in advance is a huge thing, and that's what we're going to be talking about. First of all, I want to talk about the CPU upgrade. And for creators, this is a huge upgrade. And I'm probably going to say that this is the most important upgrade you're going to do as a creator. Now, for gamers, it's not going to be as important, because the higher the resolution, the less of a CPU bottleneck you will have there, basically. But even at 1080p and 1440p gaming, you'll know that like after 1440p, are you really gonna see the difference whether your frame rate is, 170 or 180 because you've got a better CPU or something like that. But as a creator, if you're a photo and video editor especially, a CPU upgrade will give you the most amount of performance out of all the components you can upgrade. And for 3D creators, the CPU upgrade might not be the most important thing, because if you're doing a lot of the GPU rendering, so all your final renders will go on the GPU, but you're working on viewport and when you're actually modeling and working with your 3D modeling, then the important thing is to have a fast single core performance, and the latest i5s and i9s don't have that much of a difference between the single core performance. The most important comes from the multi-core performance. So I'd say it's not important, but then at the same time, if you run out of VRAM on your GPU and you need to do the rendering on CPU, having a very powerful CPU makes a huge difference. And that's when you have more cores, you'll get more rendering performance and so on. So i5, i7 and i9, for example, Ryzen 5, 7 and Ryzen 9s, this will be a huge upgrade to you as a creator as well. So when you're choosing a laptop, for example, one of the first things I would do is just pick the right CPU, okay? So pick the model that has the right CPU power for you. I'd recommend i7 is like a nice sweet spot over there. It's quite high end. i9s, you're gonna start to get diminishing returns because the cooling performance will be capped with that. But here, this i7 12700H is a very nice place to start with that. And then next of all, the GPU upgrade. This is one of those things that is the most overhyped and over talked about, especially as creators, right? Okay, gamers, we know, yeah, you get more FPS when you get a better GPU, but for creators, actually, you might upgrade the GPU, and it might give you literally zero performance, or sometimes even takes away the performance if you don't know what you're doing. And most of the time, you're better off having other upgrades first rather than GPU upgrades. As a photographer, having a good GPU will literally give you zero performance. I'm gonna say that for 95% of people, that's the end of the story. Put all your budget onto CPU and get as good of a CPU as you can. So having a 3070 Ti on this will be absolutely waste of time. You're better off getting a 3050 Ti or something like that and put all your budget in somewhere else. For example, this one here, you're gonna save a ton of cash and you won't be bottlenecked by the GPU. Now, this is not all photographers though. Some photo editing software like Topaz AI can utilize GPU, but it's not a big chunk of software that can do that. And if you're a photographer who knows that you can get benefits of having a higher GPU, you're gonna go for a higher GPU. But I'd say most photographers don't upgrade your GPU, upgrade your CPU, RAM and other bits first. For videographers, the GPU becomes more important, but I think the VRAM capacity will be more important than the actual GPU power, because depending on your workflow, I mean, this is like the golden line of everything, depending on your workflow, okay? But in my workflow, for example, I realized that I am massively bottlenecked by the VRAM of my GPU, and I used 8GB VRAM 3070, but then we upgraded to, we tried a 3080 12GB one and 10GB one, and then now we're using a 3090 Ti, which has 24GB, and I can see that I can be using up to 16 plus, sometimes 18GB of VRAM, which meant that I was massively gapped by that, because we're doing often multicams, like one camera there and another camera there, and then lots of stuff on the top. And when we're editing this, we can use up a lot of VRAM. Now, depending on your workflow, you might not have multicams and you might have just layers and you're not having other videos playing in the background. This might not be the situation for you, but just something to look out for in terms of VRAM versus GPU power. But also, if you're editing in DaVinci Resolve and you're doing a lot of color grades in Premiere Pro, and you know, even some things in Premiere Pro, some effects and color grades are GPU accelerated. So if you're doing a lot of that, a good GPU will give you performance improvement. But then at the same time, if you're just cutting video and then exporting it, having a good GPU doesn't really give you a lot of performance. For example, if you're working for a company who's regurgitating a lot of their already long form content, big, content, and just cutting and exporting that into different formats, having a good GPU there doesn't make a lot of difference. In fact, sometimes not at all. But then in 3D though, GPU upgrade will be huge. The better GPU will have, the better performance you're going to get in your GPU rendering, especially if you go with one of the latest 40 series GPUs, because they'll have completely different generation of RT cores and clock speed. So for 3D creators, you'll see huge benefit in Blender, Octane, Render, V-Ray, you name it, huge upgrades. But here now, as a laptop, when you're choosing the laptop, you'll have to choose which GPU you're gonna go for, because you can't update this later. For example, a 3070 Ti will be a good choice because you have 8GB of VRAM. If you go with some of the lower ones, like this one, what I have here, this will actually have the RTX 3050 Ti, but that only has 4GB of VRAM. So if you're doing a lot of video editing, that might be the bottleneck for you over there. So going with the right GPU from the get-go is important. Number 3, the RAM upgrade. If you're a gamer, 16GB recommended option, and then you're pretty much gonna stick there because more RAM not gonna give you any performance. As a creator, oh wow, what a bottleneck that 16GB will be for you. So for 99% of the people out there, I'd say 32GB as RAM minimum. Sure, if you want to go 16, but it will be the bottleneck of your system. As soon as you open Photoshop, Lightroom, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, any of these editing softwares, that 16 gigs will be boom, used up easily. When we're editing these videos, just for an example, when we are opening some of these projects, our RAM will be, we have 64GB, will be used, all of them. It's gonna fill it up, and then it's gonna empty the RAM, and then it's going to fill it up again, and then depending on the size and how much B-roll and stuff we have in there, it might load the RAM up a few times. So we would massively benefit from having 128GB of capacity in our editing system. Now, once we're editing on it, it's not going to use 64GB, but still more than 32GB easily. So you make sure that your workflow is not capped by the RAM capacity. For photographers, for example, depending on your Photoshop layers and how much you have in there, 64GB I think is a very good sweet spot, and 32GB might be actually small for you, but it's a good starting point, but definitely worth going 64, sometimes even 128 gigs. For video editors, the same, 32 gigs minimum. 64GB is like a very good sweet spot where you won't be bottlenecked unless you're working in some certain workflows and projects and certain things that actually fill that capacity all the way. Also resolution and stuff matter there. Now for 3D, RAM could be very important for you, especially if you're rendering out large scenes that you can't do on your GPU. You'll have to go on the CPU, and then the more RAM you have, the better it is. Often high-end 3D creators, if you remember, we built the PC for Damien, and we put 256 gigs of RAM in there. But some of the higher end studios in 3D can have even more once they're rendering huge scenes. But just make sure that you're not bottlenecked by RAM. And some people like to upgrade the RAM later on, but if you know how much RAM you need, it's easy to upgrade here as well. As you can see, we can go 16, 32 on 64, and they've labeled them very nicely as well. Recommended is 32 gigs, and ultimate, I'm not sure if this is ultimate, but because on laptop you only have two, slots there, you can have up to 64 gigs. You can select it on the get-go. Actually, it's not that much expensive upgrading straight away rather than later as well. So just something to think about. Next off, and number 4, the SSD upgrade. Now here's the difference between gamers. Gamers probably have one drive that has the OS, and programs on, and then the other one where you have the games or game library on, right? And that's pretty much it, and that's the ideal workflow. Sometimes you have just one, and that will be fine as well. But for creators, separating the drives is a huge thing. And when you're choosing the laptop, often you have a secondary slot what you can film, and why not fill it straight away? So you have one where is the OS drive. As you can see, you have 1 TB and 2 TB option. I'd say go with the 2 TB option only if you are planning to have a lot of editing done on the go without any external SSDs, and you need as much space inside the laptop as possible. Then having that 2 TB option means that you can store some of the projects or some of the assets or files also on the same drive where the OS is on. And then the same thing as the secondary M.2 slot. Depending what's your budget, get as high of a capacity of secondary drive as possible. And here obviously we've got Gen 4's ports on both of these slots. So we're gonna go with a 2 TB Samsung 980 Pro there. And now you have the OS and program separated from the project drive. And then ideally you'd have a cache drive and archive drive as well. If you don't know what storage workflow should be like as a creator, check out my storage workflow guide, where I'm also gonna explain to you how to set up cache drive and how to do that. But when you're using a laptop, I'd say use the OS drive as the cache drive if you're editing off an external SSD. If you're using the internal SSD, just put the cache drive in the same place where your project is. That would be kind of the ideal workflow. If you're building a PC, obviously, then you've got 4 or sometimes even more M.2 slots on your motherboard, and then you can add your M.2s later, or just have as much as you need for your workflow. I am using a 1 TB OS drive, 2 TB, two 2 TB project drives, and we're running out. Both of them are like Gen 4 M.2 drives. And then we have another cache drive, and then we've got a few other project drives there, depending how many videos we're like actually filming and so on. Having the right SSDs and separating the storage workflow will not just benefit you from performance, but also sorts your file organization out, and make sure that you're not storing large archive things on SSD, which is not a good idea. Now you could add an optical drive there as well if you want. This is an external one if you need that, but we've pretty much configured this. And as you can see, you can just add to basket and then save out, and then boom, you can get your laptop. Now this is not just Chillblast, this is with every single laptop manufacturer, but I'm using this Chillblast and CCL as an example here. If you're choosing a laptop to do editing as a creator, or a PC build, then having these upgrades is a huge thing for you, and knowing what to upgrade, because you don't want to spend loads more on a GPU when it gives you literally zero performance. For example, photographers, something like this will be completely fine for you. It's not going to give you massively more amount of performance than an RTX 3090 Ti, for example. So when you go in with PC, you can upgrade now or upgrade later. That's that choice. But when you're choosing a laptop, you need to know these decisions beforehand. So hopefully this actually helped you. But in order to figure out what is the bottleneck in your system, because I've mentioned, what is the bottleneck? What is the bottleneck? Here's 2 programs that can help you figure out if you are running a bottleneck in your system. Run a task manager, and on the second tab here, by the way, Control-Shift-Escape will bring out Task Manager. Go on the second tab over there, and then you can see all your different resources, CPU, memory. Just as you're editing, let it be in there, give a glimpse of eye in there. When you see your RAM, for example, filled up 100%, and you realize, whoa, I'm actually RAM bottlenecked. Or sometimes you can see your GPU 100% utilized. That might be a bottleneck. Or disk speed or CPU, you can easily see the bottleneck. Another option is to have hardware 64. So this is a completely free software that you can download. All you have to do is just install it, go free download and local, and then download it and install it to your system. Then run the sensors, and then you can monitor all of your system, what's going on. You can just leave it running in the background, and then later in the evening or after you're done your editing day, come back and just check what was 100% utilized, whether it was 100%. For example, how much did you use VRAM for? How much did you use your RAM for, or CPU for, or graphics card, or whatever? You can easily just see that later on there and then know, whoa, I was massively VRAM bottleneck, for example. That's how we found out why our editing is slow in some of the multicam edits, because the VRAM was the bottleneck. So spend responsibly, and thanks CCL and Chillblast for sponsoring this video. Thanks guys for watching. If you want to check out any of the Chillblast laptops or CCL, check it out in the video description below. Adios.